Ever feel like you're drowning in information?
Mm.
Trying to really understand something complex, but it's just too much to wade through.
Totally. Like you want to get to the core of it, but, who has the time to become an expert in everything?
Exactly. Well, that's kind of the whole point of what we do here, right?
Yeah.
These deep dives, trying to boil it down, give you a solid grasp of the essentials without getting lost in the weeds.
So, what are we diving into today? Something good, I hope.
Oh, it's a good one. It's a book that's been making some waves and definitely sparked a lot of debate. Government Gangsters, The Deep State, The Truth, and the Battle for Our Democracy by Kash Patel.
Ah, yes, I've heard about this one. Published just this year, 2023. Nonfiction, obviously.
Yep. And Patel, the author, he comes at this with, some serious firsthand experience. He's been a public defender, a federal prosecutor, even a congressional staffer.
And of course, he held a pretty high-level position in the Trump administration, right?
That's right. He was a top aide to President Trump. So he's claiming to be speaking from a place of, actually having seen the inner workings of these systems up close.
So what's the central argument here? I mean, the title Government Gangsters certainly doesn't pull any punches.
No, it doesn't. Basically, Patel contends that there is a deep state operating within the U.S. government.
Okay, the deep state. That's a term we hear thrown around a lot. How does Patel define it specifically?
He describes it as like a network of unelected officials, career bureaucrats who've become, in his words, unaccountable elites.
And where does he place these individuals? What parts of the government?
He focuses primarily on some key institutions like the Department of Justice, the FBI, the intelligence community, and the Department of Defense.
So basically, the major players in national security and law enforcement.
Exactly. And his argument is that these individuals within these agencies, they believe they're justified in taking actions to maintain their power.
Regardless of who the American people actually elect, regardless of the policies of the president or Congress.
That's his claim. And he says this deep state actually worked to undermine, to actively obstruct the Trump administration's agenda.
That's a pretty hefty accusation. And I guess this is where his personal experience working in the Trump White House comes in, right? He's saying he saw this firsthand.
Right. Now, we have to be careful here, as always, to remember we're presenting the arguments made in the book. We're not endorsing these viewpoints, just laying out what Patel is claiming.
Of course, of course. It's about understanding his perspective and the evidence he uses to support it.
Yeah.
So how does he claim this deep state operates? What tactics do they use?
Well, he highlights a few key methods. One he really focuses on is the classification system.
Oh, interesting. How so?
He argues that information is often classified not for legitimate national security reasons, but to shield actions, potentially embarrassing or illegal actions, from scrutiny.
So basically, using classification as a way to avoid accountability.
That's what he claims. He also alleges that there's selective prosecution going on. Meaning that certain individuals are targeted for prosecution while others are protected, not based on the merits of their case, but based on their political affiliations.
Ah, okay. So a two-tiered system of justice depending on whether or not you're seen as an ally or an enemy of the deep state.
Right. And he also points to media leaks as another tactic, strategic leaks to shape the narrative, to damage their opponents.
It sounds like he's painting a picture of a pretty sophisticated and well-coordinated effort to manipulate the levers of power from behind the scenes.
He is. Now, he doesn't just make these general claims. He uses specific examples to try to back them up. And one of the most prominent examples he uses is the Russiagate investigation.
Ah, yes. That whole saga surrounding alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election. A lot of our listeners will vividly remember that.
For sure. So Patel recounts his time on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the HPSCI, where he was directly involved in the investigation.
And what's his takeaway from that experience?
His conclusion is that the entire Russia collusion narrative was, in his words, a Democrat-funded, government-perpetrated crime.
Wow. He doesn't mince words.
No, he doesn't. He claims it was all based on the Steele dossier, which he says had clear links to the Clinton campaign and the DNC.
So he's saying that the whole investigation was essentially a partisan hit job.
That's his argument. And he claims that, despite interviewing over 60 witnesses under oath, the HPSCI found zero evidence that Trump or his campaign colluded with Russia.
None at all.
He says no credible evidence whatsoever. He also talks about the Nunes memo in the book, the document released by Devin Nunes, who was chairman of the HPSCI at the time.
Right, I remember that. It caused quite a stir. What's Patel's take on the memo and the reaction to it?
He portrays it as an attempt to expose what he saw as, serious wrongdoing in the Russia investigation, specifically by the FBI.
And he claims that the deep state fought tooth and nail to prevent its release.
Exactly. He says they knew it would shed light on their actions, and they didn't want that to happen.
And he's particularly critical of the FBI's use of FISA warrants, isn't he?
He is. He argues that the FBI used the Steele dossier, which he again emphasizes was politically motivated and unreliable, as the primary basis to get FISA warrants to surveil people associated with the Trump campaign.
So he's saying they were essentially spying on the Trump campaign based on flimsy and potentially fabricated evidence.
And that's his argument. He even suggests that the FBI may have deliberately misrepresented information to the FISA court to get those warrants approved.
Which would be a huge abuse of power if true.
Exactly. And he also characterizes the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller as a politically motivated fishing expedition.
Meaning they didn't have any real evidence of wrongdoing, but appointed Mueller hoping he would find something, anything, to use against Trump.
That's his take. Now, another major event he discusses is the Benghazi attack.
Right. The 2012 attack on the U.S. consulate in Libya.
Yep. He argues that senior figures at the DOJ and FBI, people like Eric Holder, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, they were more concerned with protecting Hillary Clinton's political future than with pursuing justice in the Benghazi case.
That's a bold claim. How does he back that up?
He claims they had evidence to prosecute multiple individuals involved in the attack, but they chose to only go after one person.
Why?
He suggests it was to shield Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, from any political fallout that might have harmed her chances in future elections.
So, again, the allegation is that political calculations were put ahead of justice.
Right. And he makes a similar argument about the Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Ah, yes. The laptop that allegedly contained potentially damaging information about Joe Biden's son.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Patel claims that the DOJ and FBI knew about the investigation into Hunter Biden's business dealings well before the 2020 election, but deliberately sat on it.
Why would they do that?
He suggests it was to prevent it from influencing the election in favor of Trump. He also says the FBI tried to discredit the laptop, calling it Russian disinformation, even though he claims they had no evidence to support that assertion.
Okay, so that's another example where he alleges that government agencies were weaponized for political purposes.
Right. Now, perhaps the most controversial chapter in the book deals with the January 6th.
The attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Right. And Patel takes a very different view of that day than many others do. He calls it the insurrection that never was.
So he's directly challenging the prevailing narrative that January 6th was an organized attempt to overthrow the government.
He is. He points out that President Trump actually authorized the deployment of the National Guard days before January 6th.
But the Guard wasn't deployed until much later.
Right. And Patel explains that this is because legally the deployment had to be requested by local authorities, specifically the mayor of D.C. and the Capitol Police. And he says those requests were not initially made.
So he's saying the delay was due to bureaucratic holdups, not because Trump was trying to prevent the Guard from intervening.
Exactly. He also points out that the vast majority of those charged in connection with January 6th are facing misdemeanor charges, not insurrection charges.
Which he uses to support his argument that it wasn't a coordinated attempt to overthrow the government.
Right. He also criticizes what he sees as a two-tier justice system. He claims those arrested for January 6th were often held without bail and subjected to harsh treatment, even for nonviolent offenses, while others accused of similar or even more serious crimes were treated more leniently.
He's suggesting a double standard based on political motivations.
That's his claim. And those are just some of the specific examples he uses. He also gives more general examples of alleged obstruction of Trump's agenda, like the slow pace of troop withdrawals from Afghanistan, which he blames on bureaucratic resistance within the military and intelligence agencies.
So he's saying this deep state wasn't just working against Trump on specific investigations, but on broader policy issues as well.
Right. He also claims that counterterrorism operations were sometimes hindered by internal opposition. And he points to the firing of Secretary of Defense Mark Esper as an example of Trump trying to confront what he sees as the entrenched power of the defense industrial complex.
The network of defense contractors and government officials who benefit from high military spending.
Exactly. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. He does point to some instances where he believes the government functioned well under Trump. For example, he praises the successful raid that killed ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
which he attributes to a lack of political interference and bureaucratic obstruction.
Right. He also talks about his own efforts to secure the release of American hostages overseas. So he's not saying everything was bad, but his overall thesis is that there is this deep state that actively works against elected leaders, and he believes that needs to be addressed.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? Does he offer any specific reforms to address these issues?
He does. He lays out a whole set of reforms, targeting various government institutions. For the DOJ, he calls for appointing an attorney general who will enforce the law equally, without political bias. He wants to revise the Justice Manual to prevent things like those pre-dawn raids on nonviolent offenders and the jailing of political dissidents without bail.
He's really emphasizing the need for due process and equal protection under the law.
He is. He also wants to implement clear, objective standards for prosecutorial decisions and crack down on leaks of classified information.
Makes sense. What about the FBI? Any specific reforms for them?
He proposes moving FBI headquarters out of D.C. to reduce its insularity and make it less connected to the political establishment.
Interesting idea.
He also wants to shrink the FBI's General Counsel Office, which he believes has become too powerful. And he wants to reform the FISA process to require DOJ approval before seeking a warrant.
Trying to add more checks and balances to prevent abuses of the surveillance system.
Yes, exactly. For the intelligence community, particularly the OD&I, he wants to declassify more government documents and create a more streamlined classification system. He also suggests cutting unnecessary staff at the OD&I and focusing on intelligence sharing between agencies rather than independent intelligence gathering.
So basically making the intelligence community more efficient and transparent.
That's the idea. And finally, for the DoD, he has a whole list of proposals. He wants to reassert civilian control over the military, reform the promotion process, and overhaul the procurement process to eliminate waste and the influence of the defense industry.
Sounds like he wants to take on the military-industrial complex.
He does. He also wants to ban the revolving door between government and defense contractor jobs, eliminate the Office of Net Assessment, give more operational control to the President and Secretary of Defense, and reduce the size of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Wow, that's a pretty sweeping set of reforms. It's clear he sees the deep state as a serious threat to democracy and believes drastic measures are needed to address it.
He does. Now again, it's crucial to emphasize that these are all arguments and proposals made by Kash Patel in his book. We are not endorsing them, but we want our listeners to understand his perspective.
Absolutely. It's about presenting the information in a neutral and objective way, allowing listeners to form their own conclusions.
Exactly. So, to sum up, we've taken a deep dive into Government Gangsters by Kash Patel. We've looked at his concept of the deep state, the examples he uses to support his claims, and the reforms he proposes.
It's a provocative book that raises some important questions about the functioning of government and the balance of power in a democracy.
It certainly does. And it leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given Patel's experience and the detailed arguments he presents, what are the potential long-term consequences for public trust in government institutions if the issues he raises, regardless of your political views, are not addressed? What does it mean for the future of our democracy if there's a perception, whether justified or not, that unelected officials are wielding undue influence and potentially working against the will of the people? It's something worth thinking about.
It is, and it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to check out Government Gangsters for yourself and explore the various viewpoints on these complex and important issues.
And, as always, think critically and draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.